Hello, and welcome back to Finding a Founder. Today marks our final episode in the city of Philadelphia, and we're going to be covering a topic that so far we have touched on but not spoken about in great detail. It's an aspect of Franklin's life that really set him up to be the founder we know him as today. Of course, I'm referring to his very successful career as a printer. In fact, when Franklin wrote his own epitaph at the age of 22, he said, "Here lies the body of Benjamin Franklin, printer." I'm your host, Henry Wilkinson, and in today's episode, I'm joined by James Green, who is Librarian Emeritus at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Jim is going to be talking about the founding of America's first subscription library, Franklin's rise to fame in the printing industry, another famous Franklin persona in the form of Poor Richard, and what the Library Company is up to in the 21st century. Jim, hello.
Hello, Henry.
Jim, what is the Library Company of Philadelphia?
Well, it's a library. There's sort of two answers to that question. What's our history? Because our history really determines in many, many ways what we are today. But I'll start with what we are today, because that's the way most people encounter us, of course. And so we're a research library, mostly for people who are doing advanced research in early American history. And we've got something like 1 million things, depending on how you count them. That's manuscripts, books, broadsides, newspapers, and all kinds of other visual materials, prints, photographs, daguerreotypes. So basically the whole range of early American media, I guess you could say, except that, and we can talk about this later if you want to, but except that we really focus on the period up to about 1900. And so what were we then? Well, we were founded by Benjamin Franklin as a library, but now then a very different kind of library, a library that was associated with his discussion group, the Junto, a library for young men who worked with their hands and were trying to improve their minds and their social position in their communities. So bridging that big gap between this very large, it's actually today the largest collection anywhere of early American print, with one exception, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're, in other words, one of the largest. We have as many, or possibly more, early American books than the Library of Congress does.
Right, and there's a few things I want to talk a bit more about in what you've just said. The first being, what were the books that were being commonly read during this period across the colonies?
Well, they were mostly British books. When Franklin came to Philadelphia, he says, when I first came to Philadelphia, there was not a good bookstore to the southwards of Boston, and the printers in New York and Philadelphia were merely stationers. You could buy paper, you could buy very common school books, primers and almanacs and things like that. But so there were no bookstores. So everything that anybody could possibly want would have been imported. The Library Company grew out of Franklin's discussion group, the Junto. The Junto was a group that met on Fridays. So we're talking about Franklin is about 21 years old, something like that. And he gathers together a group of his friends who are all like him, men who they sometimes called themselves leather apron men, that is people who worked with their hands and got dirty, but also had this desire to improve themselves. And they met every Friday in a tavern, or sometimes a coffee house, or sometime later on they met in one of their members' rooms, lodgings. One of the things that the Junto members were supposed to do was to each meeting, in turn, members. There were about a dozen members of this group, and every Friday they would meet, and one of them would be sort of batter up to propose a topic for discussion. And ideally, this would be something that this person had informed himself about, did a little background reading. The problem was that they didn't have any books. They each had maybe one or two or four books each, but they weren't all the ones they needed to really make for an informed discussion. That was the point, was to bring some kind of like information into these discussions, and then this was very much Franklin's influence on this group. They structured the discussions in a kind of Socratic way. The leader of the discussion would not so much present a lot of information, but try to elicit information from the other members. For a lot of these people who had no formal education at all, it was a way of gaining an education and the kind of what you might say, the facility of interacting with other people that an education helps to provide.
So what you're saying is that the members of the Junto, they each had a handful of books that they owned, but as the organization grew, as the society grew, they needed access to more books. And am I right in thinking that by founding what would become the library company, Franklin founded the very first subscription library in America? Is that correct?
Yes. Oh, that's definitely correct. Yeah. Maybe, I mean, depending on how you define the terms, maybe the first one anywhere. And so one of the first things they did when they started their meetings was to say, why don't we pool all our books, combine all of our individual little libraries together, and then we can all consult them. And that's at that point they were moving into private rooms of one of the Junto members so that they could actually leave them there and then have them not only at their meetings, but also to be accessible, presumably at odd hours outside the actual meetings. And that was Junto's first library. And this was a very formative moment for Franklin when he found out that this was not going to work. And why would it not work? Well, he was very quick to see, I suppose, that people really wanted their own books. And they started saying, well, can I just take my book back for a little bit, or can I just keep my book? And sometimes there would be mild disputes about, whether somebody's book was being treated properly. So in the end, they just all took their books back. So this is after a couple of years of Junto meetings. In 1731, Franklin proposed to form a library that would be jointly owned by all of them. And he called that a subscription library. And what was the subscription part means is that, and this was a move that he used to found absolutely everything he founded, actually, including the Philosophical Society, the Pennsylvania Hospital, and all the projects he set afoot, like street lighting or whatever, is he would get a bunch of people together and have them propose a kind of structure for an organization, a mission, if you will, a mission statement. And then they would each sign their name to it. They would subscribe to the articles of associations that would bind them together. And in the case of the library, there was really a very simple mechanism that held them all together, and that was money. Every person who signed the articles of association would pay a first upfront fee of £2, 40 shillings, which was actually a fairly interesting sum. You can say is that none of these guys were rich, and so they had to be willing to come up with a sum of money that would be that would not impoverish them or their families, but that would kind of be a manifestation of their commitment to the whole scheme. And then another 10 shillings each year after that. And that sum of money would serve two very closely related functions. One is it would provide a sum of money to be spent on books, that they would decide together what books they wanted, send off an order to England, and then a year later they would get another infusion of cash and they would send off another order. Usually it was about one, sometimes two orders a year that they sent abroad. But the other function of that money was that if one of the bylaws of this organization was that if you borrowed a book and didn't return it, you had to replace it. If you couldn't replace it, then you would forfeit your share. And at that point, you would have invested, even if it was only the first year, you would have invested 40 shillings for the sake of a book that was probably only going to be worth 5 shillings at the most. And that was how Franklin accomplished everything. I mean, I would say, without too much exaggeration, everything all the way from convincing the King of France to support an anti-monarchical revolution in America, and that it's in your interest to do this, not mine. So that was Franklin's. That's why this is a first in some sense, not the first American library, not the first community library, but it was the first one that had a mechanism built into it to make it permanent.
And so the library company in Philadelphia, you say it was founded in 1731, and the collection was growing. They put in orders annually, sometimes twice a year. But who looked after the collection? Was there anybody that was employed by the company as a librarian, or was it left to the members to keep things in order? Or And also, where were the books stored?
Well, first question first. There was a librarian. From a very early date, they decided they had to have somebody who was not only empowered to care for the books and house them or make sure they were properly housed, but also, and here's another Franklinian move, the librarian was financially responsible for any losses. In other words, if there was a book, if somehow the system broke down and a book just disappeared and nobody could be made to pay for it, then the librarian was liable for it. That was that worked okay for a while, and then in time that broke down, and maybe that's another topic for discussion. But for a long time, we had trouble keeping librarians employed for more than a year or two. And where were the collections housed? So at first they were in the librarian's lodgings. After a while, it didn't move around so much, and they were more or less permanently established in a back building on the property of a guy named Robert Grace, who was the only one of the original Junto who actually had money, and he was an iron master. That helped keep the library together. I mean, part of what's behind your question, I guess, is how the books were stored would have a lot to do with whether they would be preserved or kept together. But in 1738, the library company commissioned a great big Palladian style white wooden cabinet. I mean, and that survives to this day. It's quite tall. And when you see it, you realize, oh no, they couldn't keep this in the lodgings of the librarian. They had to have something with a higher ceiling. Sometime around that, again, it's not really very clear how this happened. But we were moved, the collection, and was relocated to a wing of Independence Hall, which of course was not called Independence Hall then, it was the State House. And that was a room and that actual structure doesn't exist anymore, but we know that it had a pretty high ceiling because it held that giant cabinet.
So we've talked a lot about the founding of the Library Company of Philadelphia, but something that we haven't talked about yet is something that came long before Franklin moved to Philadelphia, and that was his job as a printer. And actually, at the age of 24, Benjamin Franklin wrote his own epitaph in which he first listed himself as a printer by trade. So printing was obviously incredibly important to Benjamin Franklin. And Jim, you wrote a book all about Benjamin Franklin, the printer. So I feel like you're the best person to tell us a bit about this role that Franklin took on from a very early age and how printing, or rather what printing meant to Franklin throughout his life. So I was wondering if you could sort of introduce us to the first time that Benjamin Franklin enters the print trade. How does he do? How does he progress? And where does he end up?
Well, his start as a printer, as it was for an awful lot of printers in that period, was an apprenticeship. It's a little bit unusual, though, that he was apprenticed to his older brother. In 1718, his father apprenticed him to his older brother, who was 9 years older than him. And it was partly because he really liked the idea. He really loved books and he wanted to be around books, but he didn't particularly love soap and candles, which was the family business. Anyway, so Benjamin decided he could do it just as well. And he wrote an essay and disguised his handwriting and sort of pushed it under the door. And they said, "This is really good. Let's print it." And that was, at that point, I think probably the happiest moment of Benjamin Franklin's life was when he saw his work appearing in the newspaper, anonymously, of course. But that set him off. That set him on a really lifelong pattern as both a writer and a printer.
How old was Franklin when his first ever essay was published?
He was 16 years old when he published the first of these essays in the New England Courant.
And how long was he, or how long was the average apprenticeship in terms of the one that Franklin was doing? How long until he would have eventually been let loose?
I think he was probably, it could be as little as 6 years. And for somebody who was as advanced as he was, I don't actually remember if there was any stated term to the apprenticeship.
So despite perhaps being towards the end of his apprenticeship, he wanted to strike out on his own, having written some pretty successful essays in the Silence Dogood letters. Where does he run away to?
Well, so when he arrived in Philadelphia, which is, I say, he was not heading for Philadelphia, but that's where he ended up going. And after the famous scene of the walk down Market Street with puffy rolls under his arms and the flirtatious glance from Deborah Franklin, he looked up a guy named Samuel Keimer, and he's by himself. He doesn't have anybody to actually be a pressman pulling the press. And so Franklin went to talk to Keimer, and Keimer gave him a job.
So he was very, very lucky then to find work pretty much immediately.
Yes.
How did he end up then going to London, essentially, to undertake a second apprenticeship?
While Franklin was working for Keimer, he did little things that made him sort of conspicuous, that caught the attention of the governor of Pennsylvania. Was a kind of political loose cannon named William Keith. And Keith looked at Franklin and saw somebody that he could basically make him work for him, for Keith. So he took Franklin aside and said, "Young man, I think I see great promise in you. I'm going to send you to London, and I want you to buy a press and type in London. I'll pay for it, don't worry, and I'll set you up as a competing printer." And that sounded good to Franklin, so he got on the next boat for England. When the boat docked, he went to the captain and said, "You should have some letters in your bag from the governor of Pennsylvania introducing me to all these influential people and setting me up for this, and giving me credit to buy press and types." And the captain looks in the bag and said, "Nope, no letters here." So Keith had really, really shafted Franklin. And it's not entirely clear why he did this, but it certainly, he stranded Franklin in London. So he went around and very quickly found a job, and worked for a couple of very, very important people, very, very central in the London printing trade. Learned a lot about how to be a printer. Was more than he could learn from his older brother. Certainly more than he could learn from Keimer. Stayed there for a couple of years, and then decided it was time to come home. Came back to Philadelphia, and so his second arrival in Philadelphia was in 1726. So now he's 20 years old, and he comes back to Philadelphia and thinks he's going to work for a merchant or do something else for a while. But Keimer says, "Oh, come on back. I really need you." So he goes back to work for Keimer. And that's when things get really complicated, because Franklin starts working almost from the moment that he returns to Keimer's shop to set up his own printing office. He takes a partner, he raises some money, gets some backers, sets up his own printing shop in 1729.
How did he turn the Pennsylvania Gazette into one of, if not the most widely read print in America?
There are several ways that he did this. One of them was that he did what his older brother had done with the New England Courant. That is, he published little essays in it. He didn't have a famous essay series like the Busybody or the Silence Do Good Letters, but he peppered it with little skits and sketches that were really very witty.
So Franklin, he was a talented writer. He knew how to appeal to larger audiences. How quickly did the Pennsylvania Gazette spread beyond Pennsylvania? Were other colonies reading his articles?
Actually, there's not a whole lot known about that. His newspaper, when it was first established, was the only newspaper south of New York. But Franklin worked really hard to get subscribers over a really, really wide area, and that was included going all the way down into Maryland and Virginia. So I think it's probably safe to say that it covered an area that was maybe not larger than all of New England, but he became the paper that was the most, the most well-informed and the most well-written, and became the paper that people outside of Philadelphia were most likely to subscribe to. But I have to say that one of the things that helped him do that, to get an audience that was widespread, was his almanac, the Poor Richard's Almanac. And so he decided to do this sort of the same thing that his brother did with the Courant, and what he tried to do with his Silence and Do Good and essays, is to make these really sort of dull things, utilitarian things, fun to read, and he sprinkled through the almanac in very funny places where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find them. His aphorisms, the penny saved is a penny earned kind of adages that were amusing, and then he also had an essay in every year. The almanacs came out once a year, so every year there would be an essay by Poor Richard, which would be sort of amusing and kind of clownish because Poor Richard was a little bit of a clown.
I wonder if you could very briefly just describe what the average almanac would contain.
Almanacs are sometimes called calendars, and they were published in December of every year, and they did exactly the same things, in some ways exactly the same things that calendars do for us. But I mean, it gave you a way of remembering what day it was. So about half the almanac was the calendar, related to, there were also very sketchy weather forecasts and things like that. And I don't know if in Britain you still have almanacs, but there is still the Old Farmer's Almanac is still something that people buy in the United States, and they claim to believe the weather forecasts, although there's no reason why they should. But also, so the second half of it was kind of general information that you might need to look up at any time. You could find out when the various courts met in Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia. It included a list of the main roads from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia, both north to New York and south to the Chesapeake Bay area. There were, and sometimes there would be little useful things like, a recipe for curing worms or something like that, sort of household medical lore. So they were pitched at country people for the most part, but they still, as I was trying to suggest, more than most other almanacs, maybe any other almanac, also were aimed at a more literate and cosmopolitan audience.
And how long did he publish his Poor Richard's Almanac? When did he kind of put that to one side?
He wrote for 25 years until he left for England in 1757. At which point he took all the aphorisms over 25 years. There were hundreds of them, and picked all the ones that were about industry and frugality, as he put it, that literally the penny saved, penny earned kind of aphorisms, and put them together in one continuous screed, which later was called The Way to Wealth. And that is by far the longest lived and the most frequently reprinted of all the things he wrote. And that lasted forever. I mean, The Way to Wealth was thousands and thousands of editions of it were printed. It was translated into every European language and a lot of other languages as well in the 19th century.
Another focus of this podcast is obviously the American Revolutionary War, the American Revolution. What happened to the Library Company of Philadelphia in those years between Franklin leaving in 1757 and the outbreak of war in 1775?
What happened at the Library Company was nothing changed very much for a long time. As I think I was trying to suggest, that Franklin sort of created a machine that would operate even when he was not personally present, although he was in continual correspondence with the Library Company about book orders and other matters all during that time, but he was not personally there.
Was it impacted at all by what was happening around the city in the 1770s? Were the books kept safe?
Well, so actually during the Revolution, the Library Company kind of went into hibernation. And so we lost a lot of books. A lot of our directors turned out to be loyalists and had to quietly leave town. And the board never met, or for months at a time sometimes, especially during the occupation of Philadelphia by the British troops. And the minutes are hardly reflect this at all. I mean, all they say is that the secretary is out of town at the moment and there's not a quorum, so no meeting was held. Well, the secretary was out of town because he was one of the Quakers who was sent into exile and to a prison camp in Virginia by the suspected of loyalism. So it was a turbulent time that we have very little to participation in. But after the Revolution, when the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, we did the same thing we did with the Continental Congresses, which was open the library to the delegates or the representatives. And in that sense, we became, and there was, there was no Library of Congress then. When Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, they got used to, I guess you would say, they got used to having a pretty good library that they could use. When they moved to Washington in 1800, it was one of the first things they did was to set up a library, and it was the Library of Congress because it was not the Library of Washington, D.C. It was the library that Congress established. What happened then after that? When Philadelphia changed a lot when the capital moved. So Philadelphia changed a lot when it became the capital, I have to say, and it became a very much less important place when the capital moved to Washington, D.C. And we, in a sense, returned to being, again, a city library and even to some extent a community library.
So you said today the library is more of a research institution, is that correct?
Yeah, we don't lend our books anymore except to other institutions on loan.
But for those who might want to visit that don't have any research to carry out, are you open to the public? Do you do exhibitions?
We do a little bit. Under Edwin Wolf, we ramped up our exhibition and publications program, and the exhibitions are usually those are our public face. So when you come to the library company, if you don't have research, if you don't have research to do, you can talk to one of the librarians and they'll probably find it something that qualifies as research, because almost anybody who's interested in history can see anything they want. It's not like you have to have a degree or a dissertation or a book in process. We have an exhibition that is much more focused on the library company's own history than usually these exhibitions usually are, and it's an attempt to show how our collections reflect what was happening in Philadelphia during the Revolutionary period.
Great. So something for people to look forward to later this year. If they want to find themselves in Philadelphia, head on down to the library company to see their exhibition on the history of the company. So the last question, like I said, that I tend to ask, if Benjamin Franklin were to come back and see the library company of Philadelphia as it is today, what do you think he would say?
I think Franklin would have been amazed at the degree to which preserving old books and using them then to write history was something that in his time was something that only happened in Europe, but that in the United States had a history as complicated and well worth documenting as that of any European country. And I think he'd be very happy to see that can be done with libraries like the Library Company, and that historians are using libraries like the Library Company, just as they did in the old world, to write the history of America.
Great. And with that, it just leaves me to say thank you very much, Jim Green, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
That was Jim Green from the Library Company of Philadelphia. Join me next time where we shift our lens away from Philadelphia and across the pond to Franklin's third home, London, in a special two-part finale with author George Goodwin. Until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.